I never believed in ghosts. To me, the world was made of numbers, equations, and logic that fit together like pieces of a perfect puzzle. My name is Andre Luna, and I've been a math teacher for 15 years at Collegio Salbento, an old school with worn tile hallways and echoey rooms. It was a Friday night, and I was grading tests in the teacher's lounge, the only quiet place after the students left. The clock was showing 10 p.m. when I heard the first sound, a slow creaking sound, like ropes rubbing against wood. I looked up, irritated. I thought it was a janitor dragging something, but the building was empty. The sound stopped, and I went back to my tests. Then I heard it again, louder, coming from the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight. The school's lights always went out at night, and went out to investigate. The hallway was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon coming through the high windows. That's when I saw it. A figure was hanging in the air about 10 meters away from me. A girl, her gray Salbento uniform hanging from her thin body, her neck crooked, an invisible string holding her up like a broken puppet. My heart raced, but my mind screamed that it was impossible. I blinked, trying to rationalize, and she disappeared. I ran back to the classroom, locked the door, and spent the entire night trying to convince myself that it was fatigue. On Monday, I heard the rumors. A student, Zenilda Meneses, had hanged herself in the gym 2 years before. They said she was quiet, that she was bullied, that no one noticed until it was too late. I never met her. She died before I arrived at the school, but the description fit. Straight brown hair, deep-set eyes. During my class, I looked to the back of the room and felt a shiver. An empty chair seemed to stare at me, as if something there was watching me. That night, she appeared again. I was erasing the board when I heard the creak. I turned slowly, and there she was, in the corner of the room, her feet dangling inches from the floor. Her eyes were fixed on me, black as bottomless wells. My voice trembled as I asked, "What do you want?" She didn't answer, but pointed down the hallway with a bony finger. Then she was gone. My skepticism began to crack, but I still clung to logic. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was crazy. I couldn't sleep. The creaking sounds echoed in my head, and those black eyes haunted me even in my dreams. I decided to tell a classmate, Mr. Roberto, a history teacher, and the only one who seemed to take these stories seriously. He listened in silence, scratching his gray beard, and said, "You need help, Luna. This isn't in your head. It's her." He gave me the contact information for a healer named Esiuze, a man who, according to Roberto, resolves these things. I laughed at the time. A healer? It was absurd. But the next night, when Clara appeared again, this time closer, almost touching the table where I was grading papers, I decided I had no choice. I called Esiuze. He was a short, tan man with a straw hat who looked out of place in the city. When I told him what I had seen, he didn't laugh. He just asked, "Does she talk to you?" I said no, but that I was pointing down the hallway. He nodded and said, "She wants to show you something. Let's go." At school, at midnight, Esiuze carried a bag of herbs and a wooden rosary. I felt ridiculous holding a flashlight while he mumbled prayers. We went to the gymnasium where Clara died. The air was heavy, as if the building itself was breathing. Esiuze lit a pipe, and the smoke rose in strange spirals. Then she appeared, not to me but to him. "Speak, girl," he said calmly. I couldn't hear a thing, but he seemed to understand. "She's trapped," he explained later. "It wasn't just sadness that killed her. There's something here, something holding her back." I asked him what it was, but he just shook his head. "We'll find out tomorrow. Bring salt and a picture of her if you can." I didn't believe in spirits, but seeing how serious he was, I began to doubt my doubts. I spent the rest of the night researching Zenny. I found a picture in the yearbook, a girl with a sad look, exactly like the one I saw. The next day, I came back with the salt and the picture. My skepticism was in pieces, replaced by a fear I couldn't explain. Esiuze spread the salt around the gym and placed the picture in the center, surrounded by candles. He prayed loudly, words I didn't understand, while the wind blew against the windows, even though there was no breeze outside. Then Clara appeared, not floating, but standing as if she were real. Her eyes were filled with black tears. "Speak, girl," Esiuze repeated. This time I heard him. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, as if it were coming from underwater. They laughed. They locked me up. They wouldn't let me go. My stomach turned to ice. Mrs. A looked at me and said, "Ask who?" Trembling, I obeyed. "Who did this to you, Zenny?" She pointed to a door at the back of the gym, one that led to the storage room. We opened the door with difficulty. The village, it had been locked up for years. Inside, we found marks on the walls, deep scratches, as if someone had struggled to get out. In the corner, a piece of old rope, moldy. Esiuze took the photo and burned it with one of the candles, muttering something. Clara screamed, a sound that made my ears hurt, and then fell to her knees. "They left me here," she said. "The other students. A joke." I understood, horrified. It wasn't just suicide. She had been locked up, humiliated, and the rope, maybe it was her only way out. Esiuze finished the ritual, throwing the ashes of the photo into the salt. Zenny looked at me one last time, almost grateful, and disappeared. The air became light, silence returned. After that, I never saw her again. Today, I believe in what I can't see. Numbers are still my life, but I know that there are things that no equation can explain. Clara taught me that. And sometimes when I walk past the gym, I feel a shiver, not of fear, but of respect. I have been a history teacher for over 15 years, and in all that time, I have seen everything in a classroom, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced that year. I have never been a skeptic, but I also never thought that one day I would have to face something as impossible as it is scary. It all started at the beginning of the second semester, when I took on a new class in the afternoon. Among the students, there was a boy who caught my attention from the first day. He always sat in the third row, near the window, and paid attention to every word I said. His name was Miguel. Miguel was polite and extremely interested in history. While most of the students were on their cell phones or chatting during class, he wrote everything down in an impeccable notebook. He always raised his hand to answer questions and seemed to know every detail of the subjects I taught. It was as if he had studied them before. In the first few weeks, I found it strange that he never interacted with the other students. He was always alone, quiet, as if he didn't exist for the others. During recess, while the others ran around the yard or formed groups to talk, Miguel remained in the classroom, leafing through his history book. One day, after class, I decided to talk to him. "Miguel, don't you ever go out for recess?" He looked up from his book and gave me a shy smile. "I like being here. I like history." I laughed lightly and sat down at the table next to his. "That's great. You have an impressive knowledge. Where'd you learn so much?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. I always liked it. My father taught me some things when I was little." There was something melancholic in his tone. Before I could ask more, the bell rang, and he quickly gathered his things. It was then that I began to notice the strange details. Miguel never showed up in the calls I made on the school system. His name was not on the student list. At first, I thought it was an administrative error, but when I asked a colleague in the office, she frowned. "Miguel, we don't have any students with that name in your class." That answer bothered me. I went back to the classroom with a knot in my stomach. How could he be attending my classes every day and not be registered? The following week, I tried to observe more closely. Miguel always arrived before me and was already seated when I entered. He never interacted with his classmates, and the strangest thing, no one seemed to notice him. No student bumped into him. No one looked at him. It was as if only I could see him. One afternoon after class, I decided to ask a group of students about him. "Do you know Miguel? The boy who sits in the third row, near the window?" The three students exchanged confused looks. "Miguel?" one of them asked. "There's no one with that name in our class, teacher." Goosebumps broke out on my arms. He's always here. Short, dark-haired, always writing everything down in his notebook. They looked at each other and shrugged. We've never seen anyone like that. My heart raced. If they couldn't see him, then who or what was Miguel? The next day, I arrived at school early and went straight to the office. I needed to solve this mystery. I started looking through the old records, and after a few searches, I found something that made me shiver from head to toe. Miguel existed, but he had died 4 years ago. According to the records, Miguel Freitas was an exemplary student, passionate about history, but he had a bicycle accident a few meters from school. He hit his head and didn't survive. He was never able to finish his studies. So what was going on? Was I seeing the spirit of a student who didn't know he had died? I went back to the classroom in shock, and there he was, sitting in the same place, with his notebook open, ready for another class. And it was at that moment that I realized I would have to tell him the truth. I sat on the edge of the table, feeling a crushing weight on my chest. How could I tell Miguel that he wasn't alive? How could I explain to someone that their very existence was just an echo of the past? He looked at me with eyes shining with curiosity. Teacher, are we going to continue talking about the French Revolution today? My throat closed. The way he waited for my answer, so naive, so eager for knowledge. It broke my heart. I took a deep breath. Miguel, can we talk a little before class starts? He nodded, closing his notebook carefully. Of course, teacher. I hesitated for a moment. How could I be delicate? How could I explain something like this without causing pain? But then I remembered that the pain was already there. He was stuck in this place, unable to move on. How long have you been here, Miguel? He frowned. What do you mean? I've been here since the beginning of the semester. Are you sure? He looked at me, confused. Yes. I mean, he blinked a few times. I don't know. The uneasiness in his gaze made my stomach knot. Something inside him seemed to struggle, as if he was beginning to realize that something didn't make sense. I decided to get straight to the point. Miguel, do you remember the last day you were out of school? He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Then his expression changed. His eyes widened slightly, and his hands began to tremble over his notebook. Teacher, why can't I remember? I swallowed hard. Miguel, my voice almost broke. You're not alive anymore. He stared at me, motionless. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. What are you saying? His voice came out in a whisper. You had an accident. 4 years ago. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped on the floor. No, that can't be true. I come to school every day. I attend your classes. I know, Miguel, but only I can see you. The denial in his eyes was replaced by a deep fear. He looked around, as if the world around him had suddenly become strange and unreal. But how is that possible? You love history, Miguel. Your desire to learn, to continue studying, maybe that's why you're still here. He began to breathe too quickly, bringing his hands to his head. It can't be. I wanted to comfort him, but I didn't know how. So, in the softest voice I could, I said, I'm sorry. He turned to me, his eyes filled with tears. I don't want to leave, teacher. I like it here. His words hit me like a punch. How could I tell him that he needed to move on? I know, Miguel, but don't you think it's time? Don't you think your time here is over? He looked down. For a moment, I thought he was going to deny it again. But then, slowly, he took a deep breath and nodded. What's going to happen to me now? I don't know, Miguel, but I think it's time to find out. He closed his eyes for a moment, When he opened them, a sad smile appeared on his lips. "Thank you, teacher." Then, before my eyes, Miguel began to disappear. First, the outlines of his body became blurred, as if he were becoming part of the air. Then his presence simply vanished, and I stood there in the empty classroom, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The next day, when I entered the classroom, I instinctively looked for the place where Miguel used to sit, but he was no longer there. I never saw him again. But sometimes when I walk into the empty classroom before class, I have the strange feeling that there is still someone there. An echo, perhaps. A remnant of the passion of a boy who loved history more than anything. And every time I think of Miguel, I wonder how many others are still out there, stuck between the past and the present, without realizing that they are already gone. My name is Walteria, but everyone calls me Aunt Walteria. I have worked as a lunch lady for over 20 years and have worked at several schools, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced at Fidelis Madero School. I was transferred there after a colleague retired. My shift was in the afternoon and extended into the early evening. The school had a daycare center, and I had to make sure everything was clean for the next day. It was a quiet job, or at least it should have been. During my first week, I noticed that the hallways were eerily empty after the last group of students left. The lights were dim, and the silence was so heavy that every little sound seemed to echo throughout the entire school. One day, it was already past 7 o'clock when I finished cleaning the kitchen. I went to the pantry to get a dry cloth, and when I came back, I felt a shiver run down my spine. There were small, wet footprints on the floor, as if a barefoot child had walked there. I dropped the rag in the sink and looked around. The kitchen was empty. I must have spilled water, I thought, trying to ignore the strange feeling in my chest. I grabbed a mop and cleaned the marks. But just as I turned to turn off the lights, I heard a soft sound, a child's giggle. I froze. The laughter came from the hallway that led to the daycare. My heart began to race. Maybe a child got left behind. I tried to convince myself. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to light my way. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed in the silence. No answer. I walked down the hallway, and as I got closer to the daycare, the sound of laughter grew louder. But now it wasn't just one. There were several. When I reached the door, everything went silent. I slowly pushed the door open and looked inside. The room was empty. The smell of baby powder still lingered in the air. Suddenly, a baby's cry broke through the silence. My blood ran cold. The sound seemed to be coming from the back of the room, near the cribs. I took a deep breath and walked over to it. When I pulled back one of the curtains, I saw one of the small mattresses sinking by itself, as if something invisible was moving on it. My body froze for endless seconds. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. The silence returned, oppressive. I took 2 steps back, ready to run away. But before I turned around, I saw something on the window glass. Handprints, small like those of a child, and they were inside. I got out of there as fast as I could. That night, I barely slept. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning. The next day, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I arrived at school on time, prepared the children's lunches, and avoided stopping by the daycare more than necessary. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences began to become more frequent. Every night, after the school was empty, I would hear children's laughter and cries coming from the daycare. The wet footprints in the kitchen would reappear, even if I cleaned them up. And worst of all, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. One night, as I was washing the last batch of pots and pans, I heard a dull thud behind me. When I turned around, I saw that one of the children's small plastic cups had fallen to the floor. It must have slipped, I muttered to myself. I bent down to pick up the cup, but before I could grab it, it slid all the way across the kitchen. My breath caught. I straightened up slowly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The air seemed heavier, as if there was something there with me. Then the smell came, a strong smell of sour porridge mixed with spoiled milk. I covered my mouth and nose, feeling like I was going to vomit. But at the same moment, I heard a faint whisper, as if a child's voice was calling for someone. I left the kitchen in a hurry, my heart racing. I needed to know what was happening at that school. The next day, I gathered up the courage and asked the security guard, Mr. Antonio, a man who had worked there for years. He looked at me for a moment, as if considering whether or not he should tell me something. Finally, he sighed and lowered his voice. "You've seen them, right?" My skin crawled. The ghosts." He nodded slowly. "These children have been appearing for a long time, but no one likes to talk about it." I swallowed hard. "What happened to them?" Mr. Antonio looked around, as if he was afraid that something was listening. "Many years ago, the lunch came spoiled. The children ate it and started to feel sick. It was a tragedy. 2 babies from the daycare and a few other small children didn't survive." The weight of those words hit me like a punch. My God! After that, the school was never the same again. The employees who stayed late started seeing and hearing things. Footsteps, laughter, crying. So far, no one has been able to give peace to those little souls. I felt a tightness in my chest. "We need to do something." Mr. Antonio sighed. "I've already tried to talk to the town priest, but no one wants to get involved in this." I was silent for a moment. Then I decided that if no one wanted to help, I would go to the priest myself. That night, before going home, I took the bus and went to the church. I waited until the priest finished his prayers and approached him. "Father, I need your help." He looked up at me and, seeing my serious expression, knew that I was talking about something serious. "What happened?" "My daughter." I swallowed hard. "The children from Fidelis Madero School. They're still there." The priest was silent for a moment. Then he made the sign of the cross and said, "I think it's time we put those souls to rest." I didn't know what happened next, but I felt like I was doing the right thing. Here's the third and final chapter of the R. The following night, I returned to school accompanied by Father Ator. He brought a small bottle of holy water and a rosary, while Mr. Antonio, the caretaker, waited for us at the entrance with a worried expression. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, looking around, as if the invisible children could be listening. "Yes, Mr. Antonio," I replied firmly. "If no one has done anything until today, it's time to try." We walked down the hallway towards the kitchen, where the strangest events were happening. The school was plunged into silence, but as we walked, I felt a dense presence in the air. Something was watching us. The priest began to pray in a low voice, and his steps were firm. When we entered the kitchen, the sour smell filled the room. It was worse than before, as if the tragedy itself was impregnated there. "My God!" the priest murmured, clutching the rosary. Then we heard it. First, a soft baby cry. Then, faint giggles echoed through the room. I looked at the floor and felt a shiver run down my spine. The baby footprints began to form on their own, as if small, invisible children were running around us. SCU Antonio took a step back. "They're here." The priest raised his hand and began to sprinkle holy water around the kitchen. "May God bless these souls and guide them to the light," he proclaimed. The temperature suddenly dropped. The lights flickered violently, and I felt a cold wind blow past me. Then a sound made me freeze. A childish voice, soft and sad. "We just want to go home." I felt a lump in my throat. My heart tightened in a way I couldn't explain. "I know. My little angels," I murmured, my eyes brimming with tears. "And that's why we're here." The priest continued praying, asking God to take those souls to eternal rest. The kitchen seemed to shake around us. Footprints spread across the floor. The glasses on the shelves began to move by themselves, and I felt that something big was about to happen. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The bad smell disappeared. The air became lighter, and on the floor, the footprints began to disappear, one by one, as if they were finally leaving. SCU Antonio looked around, open-mouthed. Did we make it?" The priest sighed, running his hand over his forehead. "I think so." I felt a comforting warmth in my chest. The children were gone. Finally, after so many years, they were at peace. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since I started working at Fidelis Medeiros. And the next day, when I got to school, I knew that something had changed. The kitchen seemed brighter. The air was fresher, and the silence of the night didn't seem so scary anymore. The little ghosts from the daycare had finally found their way home, and I never saw them again.